Go. Hi, good to see everyone. Father Ian Van Heusen here. I'm here with a great friend of mine and a guest, Tristan Evans, and we're going to be talking about racism, the history of racism in the United States. Tristan works for the Diocese. He's the coordinator for the African Ancestry and Evangelization Ministry. I got it right. AAMEN, short for AAMEN. That's what we all call it, the AAMEN Ministry. So I'll let him tell us a little bit about himself, and then we'll kind of jump in.
So like Father Ian said, I'm Tristan Evans from the Diocese of Raleigh. I'm the coordinator of African Ancestry Ministry and Evangelization Network. So it's AAMEN, AAMEN for short. And pretty much my job is to help the bishop minister to the African diaspora. So you're looking at African Americans, Afro-Caribbean people, or Native Africans who happen to reside here in the diocese. And so it's a pleasure. Father, thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to this conversation because I think it's timely to have, and hopefully what we touch on today will allow us to open this up and find some places where we can kind of pick up and go from there.
Absolutely. And what I love is, we were talking about it beforehand, one of the things I think we're going to strive for is kind of objectivity, right?
Right.
Try to accurately understand based on our understanding of the primary sources. We're not going to try to color it and try to convince people one way or another necessarily outside of just the reality of what happened and the way things are.
Right.
And I think it's a pretty compelling that we need to have that objective view. So jumping in, so the first thing, that classic thing that everybody says, right? I mean, they say slavery's in the Bible. Slavery, that's Christianity. The idea of Christianity is tied with slavery. And of course, I think there's a lot of misconception, right? Because Old Testament slavery is not exactly the same thing that happened in the United States, right?
Absolutely, completely different. And when we look at that and dive into it a little bit more, you're going to find out, and then you're going to kind of sit back and be like, wow, how do we get there? But even before we get into that too, just going back to your primary sources that you were talking about, one of the things when we're talking about history, one of the things we need to do when we're talking about history is we need, one, to tell the whole truth. And that's why it's always important to go back to those primary sources, because you're going to see that. And then the second thing is to tell the whole truth, right? So one, tell the truth, don't lie. Yeah. Right. So whatever's there, let's look at it and then tell the whole truth. Don't go there and find out, oh, this doesn't fit my narrative, so I'm only going to tell one part of it, right? So that's to tell the whole truth. And then to tell nothing but the truth. So when you uncover what you have and you see it objectively from both sides, tell the whole thing and then let the cards fall where they lay, or lay where they fall, and then take off from there. So I just wanted to lay that out because I think what we're seeing a lot of is people will take bits and pieces of information and they'll tell their part of it, and then that gives you a different view than if you actually saw the whole picture, right?
Yeah.
So
let's jump in.
Yeah.
So with the biblical text, right? So it's in Leviticus, it's in the Torah, right? The Old Testament slavery. It was kind of more of an economic system, right? If you owed somebody money and you couldn't pay them back, you had to be an indentured servant, if you will, right?
Right.
So it wasn't necessarily like a long-term, like all of one race or anything like that.
So that in some cases, but then in some cases it was, warring tribes, and if a tribe took over, then you basically get the spoils of all the land and all the people that were there too. So it put you in a different pecking order in there. But yeah, so it was a lot of that going around. So we'll be able to also bounce back and take a look at this too and see how some of this, was it true, or did we come up with something completely different here in the United States?
Absolutely. Well, let's move along then. So we were talking about, there's the Enlightenment, Reformation. What were so some people think that like this idea of manifest destiny and some of these ideas of European dominance have their root in Christianity. But I would argue, I think you would agree with me on this, it seems to be more of an Enlightenment idea, don't you think?
Yeah, and actually, there's a lot of things that happen even before the Enlightenment, and just really briefly. So you had the Great Schism, right? So the Holy Roman Empire basically splits, right? So now you got the Orthodox and you got, the other Christians, the other 24 faithful churches, Catholic churches, right? Then, right off the back of that, you get the Crusades, and then right off the back of that, you get Reformation. So, all of this stuff is happening, and then the Enlightenment basically picks up from there. And so where do we find ourselves?
Yeah.
So in that regard, we might have some of those spoils of war, slavery type things going on. And that, again, depends on who the victor is. Was it, the Vikings or whoever? How did they treat the spoils of war? You had the Muslims and the Christians. How did they treat the people that they took over? And then what about the other tribes that we would call, barbarians or whatever? When they made conquests, what were the spoils and how were they treated,
Absolutely. Where would you see the shift where it became, because it really, in America, it became people of African descent from Africa and kind of a crystallized view. I think we might agree with this, that was kind of unique in human history, right? Or maybe not completely unique, but it was its own kind of thing, right?
Yeah, so you think about the technological advances, so you start to get into the exploration, right? So you look at the Portuguese when they go into the Congo, right? And they're, basically Christianizing India and the Congo and places like this. But then that's when you start to get, this slave taking, this slave movement going. And you start thinking about, okay, well, we had indentured servants, right? Okay, we're gonna go to this new land. I'm gonna sell you 7 years of my life because I'm probably in a lower class or an outcast here. So I'll work for you. After our contract is up, you set me free and I'm gonna go. Well, when we come to the United States, and even before the United States, Barbados and some of those first places that we hit on the American continent, and then you start to see, okay, well, I don't have enough indentured slaves, so for me to really bolster up, my workforce, and I don't want to pay for it because indentured slaves are free, or indentured servants are free. Well, so did these captive people that you were snatching up, and all right, then you put them in a servitude too, right? So it just kind of perpetuated them when people started thinking, oh, free labor, and there's just slew of it. We can trade our technology for lives, and so we see a perversion of this whole servant class, or that whole diminishing of humanity, even worse than being an indentured servant or just a slave who happens to be somebody who was captured as a spoil of a lost battle or whatnot.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Absolutely. So we talked about the beginning of America, where actually, it was kind of a hot button issue from the beginning, right? Slavery. So what was slavery in early America? Can you give us a little background with that?
Yeah, so slavery, and when we talk about slavery, what we really think about is slavery. I'm so sorry, Father.
That's all right.
That is terrible, isn't it?
That's how they know it's really live.
It's live, trust me. Tim, don't kill me. So when we talk about the slavery in America, it had already started to get to where we didn't want it to be, in the ugly parts of what we saw, because slavery hit Barbados first, and that's when the slaves actually had a slave code, and it was pretty much starting to diminish humanity. They weren't considered human beings anymore. They were basically considered not even second-class citizens. They were considered animals that we would just purchase, and they were beasts of burden, right? Yeah. And it was a lot of things doing that. So you start looking at when that comes into the forming of the colonies and things, and especially when it started coming into the formation of the United States, you have these people who are under British rule, and they're saying, oh, well, we want to be free. We don't want to pay these taxes on our tea and blah, 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 blah. But a lot of people that they were asking for help were saying, well, you want to be free from the king, but look at the people that you have in servitude to you. Yeah. Now, we're coming up to the Revolutionary War, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening inside these colonies too. So as we're starting to form the United States, then you start seeing the people in the United States really starting to have these conversations too. Especially if you look at what the Quakers did. The Quakers, when Pennsylvania was set up, they were building slave ships and they were importing slaves, but the Quakers started looking at their religion and saying, you know what, this is just not really compatible with my faith, right? Yeah. And they were very proactive, and they started doing all kinds of things. One, they made sure they started with their community first, and they rooted it out of the community, you know, and then if you basically didn't agree with that, then you weren't part of the community anymore. Yeah. Right, which is really important to them, to be part of a community. And then they started proactively going out and helping free slaves as well. And then you also had the indentured servants who were like, oh, I don't want to be part of this either. So you would find out, and there's a lot of history when you start looking at some of the interactions between the races and stuff. And what you'll find out is that there's this elite class who basically were pulling all the strings, but all the working class and poor people, they had more of a symbiotic relationship. So it would be nothing for, you know, two slaves and an indentured servant to take off. Yeah. You know, it wasn't just the slaves breaking free, it was everybody. And they sometimes would steal the master's gun, and they would go, and you would even see, if you went back and looked at the original ads that were put in about runaway slaves, they would tell you all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, so.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and so it's a really interesting story. Sometimes people, they take for granted ideas like international law, human rights, and it wasn't all the Catholic Church. There was in part Enlightenment thinkers, but in this strange paradox, as slavery is rising in Western civilization in the Americas, there's also thought, and I'll kind of add a little bit to this, is like in some of the schools of Europe and Spain, they start to reflect on this idea of international rights, human rights as kind of a, and it's interesting. Some people don't seem to understand that was kind of new to human history. The idea, you know, the idea of international rights, national boundaries, borders, and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about what was the Church's response? What was the Catholic Church's response to slavery? Because there's a papal document, I should have looked it up beforehand.
Yeah. So the overall Catholic Church and the documents there, and we're really good with writing documents and you know, saying what's really good and what's and what we should be ascribing to and what we shouldn't. But then we have to also look at practice too. Yeah. And so when you go into certain countries, specifically the United States, the Catholic Church goes in, and wherever it is, it tries to fit in, not fit in as in, you know, kind of do, you know, I want to be liked by everybody, but it's more, you know what, we're a small corner, so we need to help where we can in this area, and then we will expand. But in the United States, it took a different tone, and so, you know, in some instances, like you take Fort Mose, which was right next to, or actually Fort Mose, M-O-S-E, that was in Florida, which is part of St. Augustine, Florida, which had a heavy black population. And Fort Mose was actually a fort that had free black people, right? And so that was a whole community within the forming of the United States, where outside of there was just a completely different life, right? And so as England and France and Spain and the Dutch are jousting for these different positions, you can see where some Catholic influences are, and then what the Catholic Church had to basically put up with, and where the Catholic Church may have not been as strong as we would have hoped they would have in some instances. And so, you know, it's hard. And I mean, depending on how you want to look at it, you have a different opinion of what the church's place was. I think. Well, it's a fascinating dynamic, right?
I can't remember when the Pope. I have to look it up. I should have looked it up before. There was a papal document where the Pope condemned slavery as it was practiced in the New World, But then on the same hand, what you're kind of alluding to is there's kind of a checkered history, right?
Right.
Up through civil rights. I mean, there's a checkered history at the time of the Civil War, right? There was religious orders that had slaves, like the Jesuits, I think, and some of those, and there was some, of course, the history of racism.
And you
So
think
let's-
about John Paul II too. He actually made the big proclamation of apologizing for the orders that did have slaves and how the church how they behaved during slavery.
Absolutely. Let's jump ahead. So Civil War. I think we're all familiar with overall the Civil War, but we want to deal with three particular primary sources that dealt with this period of Reconstruction. There's Washington, Du Bois, and Garvey, and they kind of each represent a different view on what African Americans would do after the Civil War. So tell us a little bit of that and then kind of lead into some of those ideas.
Yeah, so it's really three different thought processes. And I'll start with Garvey first, because Garvey's was, we're never going to be accepted into this society as black people. So what we need to do is we need to go and have a place that is all for us, and we have our own destiny in our own hands. We don't have people constantly, toying around with us. And so, and you saw Garvey moved out, and then if you look at a number of African Americans, when Liberia under President Monroe was created, that's what they did. They actually went to Liberia and set up a country. And you can think of that of kind of like the Jewish community does with Israel now, right? They're moving from all over the different places in the world, and they come to Israel. So that was kind of the Garvey mindset. Now the other two,
Back to Africa, Black nationalism.
The Back to Africa movement, absolutely. So then you have Du Bois, and then you have Booker T. Washington, who basically took two different steps in what do we do when we stay here. We either, under Washington's structure, is go out, get an education, learn a trade, and then build things for black people so that we have and build up our communities that way. And then if we are ever accepted into the society, then we can be still productive members in society. But if not, we can still do good for ourselves here.
Yeah, like what you might call like a bootstrap, like maybe not completely that, but like let's work,
Yeah, well, obviously education was going to be very important, but education shouldn't just be education for being able to read and write and do arithmetic. It needed to be that, but then it also needed to be something, where you could actually go out and make a living. So, you could be a carpenter, a plumber, an electrician, an engineer, any of that stuff. You could be a banker, you could start an insurance company or a makeup company or whatever it is and serve your community. So that was that mentality. And then you had Du Bois, who basically said, we need education. Education is going to be important, but at the same time, not only are we supposed to be getting an education, but we also need to be demanding, we need to be demanding our rights and things of that nature too, which we didn't disagree with. But then you also look at, and so he was the one that developed the NAACP. And so, obviously that was an organization that also helped, build people up in the black community and to give them a voice. But one of the differences was Du Bois also said that there should be this top 10%, this elite who would become the leaders of the black community and help them navigate their way. And so that model in some instances has been taken up as well. But
I think those three views actually summarize a lot of the history that follows. Some of the muddy history. I was talking with Tim about it over dinner. Just the complex histories of the 60s, 70s onward. So you have the one tendency, which is the black nationalism, which still exists in some ways to this day. Some people argue for a separate, like, black controlled community, African American controlled community. You have the Du Bois, like more the kind of fight within the system, kind of demand rights.
Yep.
And then kind of the Booker T. Washington, which is build institutions, build black-owned businesses, kind of raise up generation after generation, and kind of, because he almost saw it more as a gradual transformation, right?
Right.
That as they, they built their own they built economics and kind of slowly over time made progress, where Du Bois wanted more things quicker, basically. I mean, that's how I've...
Yeah, so, and when you're in one of those situations where, for lack of a better word, a knee is on your neck, you want that knee off immediately, right?
Yeah.
And you want it now. You don't want to wait, 3 or 4 minutes down the line. I think we could see that too during Reconstruction after the Civil War. If you look at the 50 years after the Civil War, even though, some things were happening contrary to the winning of the Civil War, you saw immediately the black community getting better, right?
Yeah.
You saw them develop in places like the Black Wall Street. We had one here in Durham, North Carolina, but then there was one in I want to say Arkansas or Oklahoma too, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So those were some big things, and then you also saw that all of a sudden in federal government now you have black representatives and black senators and things like that. The unfortunate thing is, making a deal with the devil. Like I said, the founding of this country has always been a battle against good and evil, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of knock it down during the Civil War, but you don't put the coup de grace in, and then you go, okay, well, let's try to appease the devil, and the devil's always going to try to take more. So then that's when you start seeing, okay, now the slave codes have gone away during slavery, but now we start to enter into Jim Crow laws, and the Jim Crow laws are not just laws, but it's a whole etiquette system too. So, if me and you were walking down the street back then,
Yeah.
If I walked past you, I had to look at the ground. Or if it was a white lady here, I would need to cross the street.
Yeah.
Crazy
And we
stuff like
we
that.
still have families in North Carolina, African-American families, where the older generation grew up in some of that, right?
Yeah, and that's one of
I
the
mean,
things.
which is something that some
Yeah.
people don't, a lot has changed in the past 40 years, but there's still people who remember some of those dynamics.
Yeah, because I was looking back at my family tree, and I could go 5 generations back, and I started putting the dates and going, wow, this is what my great-great-grandfather was going through, and this is what my great-grandfather is going through. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is what my grandmother was going through, and this is what my mom went through. And I was fortunate, I was born in '69, so all of the struggle and fight that had gone on in those generations, I was a benefactor of, so I basically gained the rewards, reaped the rewards of that. So, but there are some people, depending if you were ones like my family, who were able to get out of the South. And then think about it, my family from where I could go back was either deep Florida or deep Alabama, Mobile, Alabama, right? So they ended up in Cleveland, Ohio. So that went to show you, they went from the South Coast to the North Coast. They were like, we're definitely getting out of,
Which is sometimes
the deep
referred
South.
to as the Great Migration.
Right.
So there was a huge influx and led to things like the Harlem Renaissance,
Yeah.
things like that. We had the writers and yeah,
Right.
so what's interesting, so this whole pattern of Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Garvey, it really does carry over into the politics of the 60s and 70s, right? It's not, the civil rights movement and all that follows is not a monolithic thing, right? There's different movements with it. So you have, on one hand, you have Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the Black Panthers.
Malcolm X.
Malcolm X.
Yeah.
And
along with Elijah Muhammad and a lot of those groups. Yeah. So. Yeah.
you walk us through a little bit, because well, actually, before we get into that, and throw in all of this, is we have the fight with communism, right?
Right.
So, we've talked, I think, before about the Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison,
Yep.
that in a lot of ways the Soviets would use the African American issue as a kind of means of making tension in America. Sometimes, so a lot of these politics get really muddled, right? So on one hand, you have this grave injustice against African Americans. Now, on the other hand, you have communists and anarchists who are using that as an opportunity for different things. Like, that's what's kind of chronicled in The Invisible Man a little bit, right?
Yeah. So in that scenario, we step back from just social and economic, and we have to start to bring in some more politics to it, right? So any country is going to have other countries or other ideologies, right? So we have this free market, capitalist, democratic republic, right?
Yeah.
And so what we've become, but then you have these outside forces too. And so, especially when you talk about communism and even socialism and things like that, they will find, any areas of stress and conflict, and they will bend those to their will, too. And also, then you also have to think about these elites too, who are, that we have running different things. They will try to influence. I mean, you think about it. If you have a company that's trying to sell something, your marketing department, one of the roles of advertisement is to get the population to buy your product, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's the same way with these other ideologies too. Those ideologies will try to find ways to get you to support their ideology. And so you would see a lot of times struggles that people are fighting a good fight for what's right and what's just, and they might get support by these outside ideologies too, which
the book Invisible Man kind of chronicles, where he's used by the Communist Party as a puppet and then kind of discarded. And then there's Paul Robeson. Is it Paul Robeson, the singer? He sang in Russia, like they brought him. It was this interesting dynamic, because one of the things I knew is it's just a fascinating story. Is a lot of the historically black colleges in the South, like Fayetteville State, I believe they would tour Europe and they would tour some of these other countries, and they would sing like African American spirituals and things like that in some of these cultures. So there's this interesting dynamic where, the African American history corresponds with a lot of national history, international history. Rambling a little bit. Awesome. But all right, so let's jump in. So, okay, what's the main difference? So we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and we have like Black Panthers and some of those. What are some of the politics of the 60s and 70s when it comes to civil rights and it comes to the push for equality and things like that?
Okay, so, Dr. King is starting off more the mindset is, we're going to be kind of like the Quakers did. We're going to say, okay, if you're, we're going to appeal to your Christianity. If you profess that you're these good Christian people, then how can you be telling another child of God that they have to sit at the back of the same bus that all of us are going to ride? Why do I have to drink at a different water fountain? Why can't I eat at the same counter? And he started civil disobedience, and really nonviolent resistance, right? So that was that thing. And then Malcolm X is like, you know what? He's more like, you need to find who the person is, the puppet master that's back here. And at the same time, you are at a point now where you need to stand up for yourself. And if one of them, hits us, then we're going to hit one of them.
The ballot or the bullet, right? The classic speech, the ballot or the bullet.
Right. And so then you start to take the Black Panther movement, and then they said, you know what? Okay, we're going to take that too, and we're going to make it militant, and especially when you think about, you have a police force at that time that were putting dogs and and fire departments throwing hoses on you, where they're like, well, you know what, we're not going to have that happening to our community. If you're going to stick your guns and dogs on us, and we're going to retaliate with our guns and things too.
Wasn't there the heightened moment? It was the first time a group had brought guns into the Congress, I believe, or something like that, that the Black Panthers came. I think they took, or what was it? Something like that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so, and then actually,
it
black people and guns actually go back a little bit further than that. When the black people first actually got the opportunity to vote, the women actually got guns. In NRA, basically, we're training black people how to shoot and how to protect themselves, right? And so it was nothing for every family in our neighborhood to have a shotgun. right? And it was like when you went down to the ballot, when the men went in to vote, the women stood outside with the shotguns saying, if anybody's going to try to stop us from voting, you know, we got a lot of buckshot waiting for you.
Too funny. So we have these different reactions to, which was a complex, unjust situation. I think everybody agrees with that.
Yeah.
So the problem is, I think we could start to unpack this as we move forward into our current situation, is as much as the Black Panthers, for example, let's start with them, as much as they're addressing a unjust situation, Martin Luther King seems to be a little bit more of a good example of somebody who holds the values of the United States. Some of these groups clearly had Marxist tendencies. They wanted to overthrow the government. They were involved with movements to overthrow the government. How did that history, what are your thoughts on how that history kind of developed?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that led to this, and I think it would be kind of a disservice to kind of just go straight to the Black Panthers and talk about that, because you think about, there was a KKK first, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like, you know what? If the KKK is going to terrorize us, we need to have somebody that's going to be in our community that's going to defend us. And you know what? I don't care if it's the Black Panther Party, if that's who it's going to be, or I don't care if it's the Nation of Islam. If they're allowing us to have, you know, peace in our community, you know, that's what we're going to have. But like I said, some of these groups could be infiltrated, or it could just be, in some instances, you know, you think about Dr. King, and you know, the CIA and FBI are all saying that he's, you know, a communist, and you know, they're watching him day and night. So it's like, is it the KKK that's after him, or is it this big elite machine that's after him? So, so we have to struggle. I mean, the African American community had to struggle with that. But if you even go...
Well, and there was cases, I mean, there are cases of, I think with COINTELPRO in the 60s and 70s, where they would actively do things to these groups to try to disrupt them, like drugs, informants, people within the group that were pushing them on a radical direction, but were actually turning. So it was a really checkered past. And there's that crazy story of the MOVE organization, and I'm not a big believer of the MOVE organization in Philadelphia, where the police literally dropped a bomb on their house during one of those sieges. I mean, that was kind of a crazy situation. That was in the 80s. So there's this, it's hard to find a good guy in some of these scenarios.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of, it's like, I mean, as much as we may not support, so, I mean, so that's kind of part of the heart of the...
Yeah, and so that's where you get a lot of people who have, you know, pains now, because if you think about the Black Wall Street that was in Oklahoma. You know, this is a thriving community. They had their own banks, they had their own restaurants, they had their own hospitals, you know, everything. And then all of a sudden, you know, a rumor gets out that, you know, a elevator attendant is trying to touch a white girl, and then all of a sudden the whole city or everything around it erupts to the point where people who have airplanes are going down to the airport and actually firebombing this whole community. I mean, it was a terrible massacre.
That's crazy.
So when you see that the whole white community is doing that, if you're somebody who lived in that, or your parents who survived that tell you the story, or you see the what's the fallout of that, then you have a different outlook, because then you start to hear people say, "Oh, well, not all white people were bad," but they were like, "Well, where were they?"
Yeah.
You know, in my town, right? But I do want to actually kind of temper that too, because like one of the things is, you know, the United States is a racist country. Well, I mean, then we do all those people in the Civil War, all the people, you know, in pre-Civil War, and then all the people who marched with Dr. King and all that stuff.
I had family that were abolitionists.
You know, yeah. So it's like you discredit them by doing that.
Yeah.
But I think we have an opportunity as a church to, like I said, it's kind of a reconciliation process. And what that looks like, I have some ideas. There could be some other things that other people might think about too. But there's a lot of things that need to be healed because, like I said, I was born on the back end. Martin Luther King was killed a couple of years before I was born.
Yeah.
But people are still reeling from that. So my grandmother, my mother, my great-grandmother were all still alive then, right? So they remember that stuff just like it's fresh. So, you get us who have been, benefactors of where we are today, and you go, oh, well, it can't be that bad because somebody else can come from India and they only have $2 in their pocket and they can take off. But then you have a group of people who said, since we've been brought to this country, we've been getting the wrong side of the stick, and then when is it going to stop? And then now that I have an opportunity, and maybe, I'm still living out some of that because, you think about what people go through that's really traumatic, and we have ways of, meeting their needs. But, have we done such a great job in really meeting those needs? Now, I can say in education, yeah. We've given people access to schools. We've given people scholarships to college and things like that. But other places like in housing, there was a moment in time not too long ago, like in the 20s in this country, even up to the 50s, where you could go and try to buy a house in a neighborhood and you can't buy a house in this neighborhood. And there's still people running around today that my wife was out trying to buy a house before we got married, and people came up to her, and just because they felt very comfortable, they were asking her, is there any black people in this neighborhood? And if it was, and they didn't want to even be buying in there. So we still have that mentality that's going on. And so how do we make sure that we walk side by side with those people and ensure that they know they're not alone, right? Or if we're descendants of abolitionists, if we're followers of Martin Luther King, we need to be actively a little bit more active and visible to root out those things, because you'll go and you'll see things that I'll never be able to see, and it's just because of the color of my skin, right?
Well, and I think part of the tension, some of my favorite content creators deal with this. And I think the African American dimension adds a unique part to this. But I think one of the challenges of living in a pluralistic society, when you're encountering lots of different cultures, is learning to understand the differences in cultures. That's a real challenge. Because I've talked about this. It was interesting. I was doing a Zoom call around the time of the George Floyd, the beginning of that. Right. Actually, I think around the time we did the first Zoom thing. Yep. And I was talking with some folks internationally from India and from Latin America. And many of these dynamics are in play in many places. So people from the north don't like people from the south. People who are dark skinned don't like the light skin don't like the dark skin. A lot of these dynamics, it's really not just an American white-black thing. It's really, there's definitely that particular dynamic, but we have to train people not to be kind of in group, cliquish, me and my group is right and everybody else is wrong kind of thing. Because people can do that, right? Well,
you think about when a lot of the immigrants started coming into the United States. I'm from Cleveland, so you had on the east side, you had the Jewish population, you had the Puerto Rican population, you had the black population. On the other side, you had the Irish and the German or whatever, and they all basically lived in their little enclaves, right? They're enclaves because that's where, so you could go to the Jewish deli because you knew where to go because it was in the Jewish community, right? So we had that. So how do you, and it's been that way from the very beginning. These colonies, they were all set up by different types of people, right?
Yeah.
So what you're doing is you're basically taking that, but then you have this terrible sin of chattel slavery that we had here in America that was worse than anywhere. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, something that's a very interesting note to people, and I don't know if folks know this, but because of what we did here with race in the United States, it actually led to what happened in Germany. with the Holocaust and everything, because those eugenicists like Margaret Sanger and all those people who were saying that black people were inferior and blah, 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 and run all these experiments. Well, the Germans got a hold of that too, and some of their scientists started tapping into that and saying, oh, and then all of a sudden they became outsiders there too.
Yeah, so, and it's interesting you just mentioned that. You moved through a lot of information quickly, just kind of go back to, that's good stuff.
I get passionate about this stuff.
So Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, right?
Yep.
So Planned Parenthood was in part to eliminate minorities, and it was part of a eugenics movement, which was was it the 20s and 30s, I think? Well, right before World War II. Teens, 20s, early part of the century.
Yep.
So the eugenics had this view of almost the superiority of the European race. This isn't a particularly Christian. In some ways, you might, not to get too political, but it would almost be called progressive. They believed in a kind of science and enlightenment, that this new science, this new enlightenment would lead to the fulfillment of the white race kind of thing. And some of these this is really more the white, like the kind of some of the white supremacist type ideas with eugenics.
Absolutely.
And that would have an influence on Nazi Germany. Because actually, so interesting, So we're at about 45 minutes. Maybe we should check to see if there's some questions online. And I think is there anything else you want to say before we get into questions?
No, we'll take some questions, but while we're waiting for those, and Tim, if you have any, just kind of give us a hand signal, and I'll cut and we'll answer some of those.
We'll check the comments and.
There's just been a lot of questions about the Black Lives Matter as an organization, and how to have conversations about the organization as a political organization, and supporting that or not supporting that without seeming racist.
Yeah. Do you want to tackle that?
Well, either one of us, and it's like this. If what the topic we're talking on is so much bigger than Black Lives Matter, it's, this Black Lives Matter, or what they're projecting, is something that we've been talking about the whole time, right?
Yeah.
We've really been talking about how at the beginning of this country, there was a struggle back and forth about Black lives do matter, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in certain times, we did very bad in doing that. But remember before when I said tell the truth, tell the whole truth, and tell nothing but the truth, I think what we find out here is that we get not the whole truth. And so even with Black Lives Matter, we have to go back to the primary source. So go to their website, see what they're all about, and then really see if that really jives with what we're really fighting for. Is it really our struggle? And you think about it, I've seen a lot of these things where, these riots break out in town, and you had a sweet little lady in her black community owning her black store, and it's burned down, and people that are spraying Black Lives Matter aren't even the black people.
Yeah.
And again, organizations will take opportunities to get after that, but we have to take on the true battle of, managing this problem that slavery has, dropped on this country, and really be the people who champion the fight that the abolitionists had, and then the same fight that Martin Luther King had.
And exactly. And I think one of the things that I found that I think is a huge struggle right now, and I think my hope in doing this talk was to try to overcome this tendency, is in our soundbite culture, in our tweet culture, it became a Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. It's like, well, there wasn't any depth to the conversation.
Yeah.
Like they didn't, the things that we've covered weren't being discussed. And I think the big thing I want to try to train folks that are paying attention and try to build is having reasonable conversations or you flesh ideas out, right?
Right.
So somebody might say, well, there's some tendencies within the official organization of Black Lives Matter that I disagree with, but we can still work to end racism and things like that. We can still address racism. And I think also trying to understand, I think one of the things, some people were triggered. Early on, I was kind of debating, I was like, how can we talk about systematic racism and things like that? And then I looked at St. Thomas Aquinas, I'm going to be preaching on it this weekend, is the idea of distributive justice really does relate to this idea of systematic racism, which is that there is, so distributive justice is what is the whole owe the part. So all of society as a whole. And I think you have to, on a regular basis, examine your laws and examine things and try to look for justice, but really not just, not in a kind of feel-good way, but concretely, like what are the laws, what are the practices, and have those discussions.
Right. So I'm glad you said that, because I brought my little pocket constitution, and when we talk about systemic racism, you can say, well, you have some people go, oh, there's no systemic racism, and then you have other people go, oh yeah, it was. And I mean, if you look at our Constitution, Section 2 of Article 1, and also until we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, there were things in the Constitution that basically made us African Americans, when I say this, or the Africans who were brought over as slaves, is we weren't considered, part of the citizenry. Now, also, in some of those communities and some of those colonies, that wasn't true, because you had free black people that were there. And so they would have been ones who voted on their representatives who went up and wrote the Declaration of Independence, right?
Yeah.
So they would have been the ones who helped vote for people to go up and represent them and write the Constitution. It might not have been a whole heck of a lot of them, but they were there. And so we need to look at that too. And then, so yeah, we had that systemic racism, but then what you saw in this beautiful Constitution too, with those amendments, is that you could see that there was the struggle between good and evil, and we started taking those things out, where the African American was like, no, you are a citizen now. And if you think about this, if you think of the mindset of our three, Du Bois, Garvey, and Booker T. Washington, if you take it back then, you think of, we fought in the Revolutionary War, we fought in the Civil War, and we fought on both sides too. And
Yeah.
people get kind of burnt up about, the stanza in the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem where it says slaves. Well, guess what? The British only started doing that because the Americans said, well, we'll free our slaves and they'll fight on our side. And so the British were like, okay, well, we'll entice them away from their communities by saying, well, you know what, if you fight for us, then we'll free you too. So we were like, okay, if you go and fight for them, then when we capture you back, you're gonna be a slave. If you fight with us and we win, you're free.
Yeah.
So that was a fight on both sides, right?
That makes sense.
But we don't see that unless we go back and look into the primary sources, okay?
Yeah, well, maybe that's part of it is we talked about this, we were talking about this before, is I think one of the things that's been really destroyed the past 30, 40 years is the humanities. It's been infiltrated by a lot of, and I'm speaking as somebody who was kind of an insider. I've studied this thought, studied postmodern thought, gender ideologies and things like that.
Right.
Whereas one of the things that we've been arguing and we've been discussing, not arguing, but like a position that we've been taking is for this idea of going to the primary sources and trying to understand things, not through some ideological filter, but really trying to understand these primary sources. So you have some of them here. You have Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right.
You have the souls of Black folks.
Yeah.
I would be wondering how many, because I've often asked some students how many of them in their humanities courses in college or in high school have, for example, read Native Son by Richard Wright, W. Du Bois, the Soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those kinds of works.
Absolutely.
It's kind of an interesting dynamic right now. We hear about these concepts, but how much should we read the primary source? Because I think that's also one of the things I wanted to talk about when we were talking about Reconstruction is I think those general dynamics, those general tendencies are at play with the current movements, right? So you have a section of folks that are kind of arguing for almost like a separate black community with more control. You have folks that are maybe like more like a Booker T. Washington, you know, black entrepreneurship, you know, kind of building up businesses.
Yeah.
And then you have the W. Du Bois type who want to gain political power and things like that. And it's kind of those dynamics are still in play. And it's like the more you understand history in that way, the patterns of history, the more you start to understand the present moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's just like, you know, I have Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, actually it was Du Bois who actually started using Uncle Tom as a kind of a pejorative towards Booker T's idea.
Yeah.
So that's where the whole Uncle Tom, and then
Yeah.
Malcolm X started using it for Dr. King and all of his
Yeah.
people too, right? And so it really became one of these things. And now, you know, if I say some of the things I say and just kind of put it out on the table, people look at me and be like, that's the Uncle Tom. You know, he's a sellout. But then it's like, okay, so you never read the book. Because you read the book, you will understand that was one of the things that helped tip the scale for Abraham Lincoln to actually go to war and fight for the freeing of the slaves, because a lot of the abolitionists and people were reading that and going, wow, you know, the plight of this individual, depending on who his master was, you know, he was always a slave regardless, you know, he was less, and so people could tell him what to do.
Yeah.
But, you know, his good master, if you could say good master, got into debt and had to sell Tom off, right, to a wealthy, terrible master, right? And people were saying, no, these human beings should have their own destiny, right? And so when they call me Uncle Tom, I just sit back and go, obviously you never read the book. And you wouldn't even be able to even have some of the freedom you had if that book wasn't written, you know?
And so I think kind of ending a little bit on an interesting note, I wasn't planning on talking about this. I love some of the African-American literature and art. I mean, I think the greater attention needs to be given to that in school. Have you ever heard the song, is it Ella Fitzgerald, Strange Fruit?
Yeah.
That's like a haunting song. It's a crazy haunting song. If you ever look at the idea is strange fruit hanging on southern trees.
Yeah.
It's about lynchings in the South. Mm-hmm. And that was written in the 20s and 30s, right, I believe?
Yeah.
Or 30s or 40s?
Yeah.
And it's a haunting kind of, and also profoundly beautiful at the same time. What would you say, like some of we talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was actually written not by an African American, but what were some of the great things of literature that you've enjoyed? Or
Well, one of the first things I did is I was always curious, because it was just recently this week that I was actually able to kind of flesh out the rest of my family tree, to kind of get back to some of those generations. And what really got me into doing that is I lost my grandmother, who was 90 last year. And then I started thinking, when I'm looking back at that coffin, like, oh my gosh, you know, there's all that history that if there was no question that was asked about what was going on back then, there went the opportunity to do it. So I was able to call my cousin and her cousin in Detroit and get him to kind of fill in some of the missing pieces, which was great, because then I was able to go back a little bit further too. But so the slave narrative, which I kind of brought one of these. It's actually it's 16 volume collection, but this is actually first-hand accounts of people right after the Civil War. They actually interviewed all these people in all the different slave states and wanted to know what their experiences were like. And so you get a chance to hear primarily firsthand from them, and they actually have some recordings too. So it's not just that somebody else is writing, you actually get a chance to hear them actually talking about their plight.
it's crazy.
Another good thing too.
And then I want to interrupt
go
briefly.
ahead.
I think one of the things that emerged after George Floyd, I think it triggered a lot of people, and I think there's a way of misunderstanding it and a way of properly understanding it, is a big thing that was pushed was we need to listen, right? Like listening.
Yep.
And I think some people read this as, I need to go up to like my black friend and say, can you tell me about all the ways I've made you feel bad or something, and like, something to that effect. But I think there's a deeper principle that we're kind of getting at is there's this story of slavery, of civil rights, like, and understanding this story is an important part, I think, of being American, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I'll give you some examples, and I'll use the church for an example, okay? So you think about in 1887, the Diocese of Raleigh actually built its first African-American church because we had to do the separate but equal thing, right? So you think about, I went to the archives and I found this little Catholic Education in North Carolina book, and it actually goes through, and you can see like in Fayetteville.
Oh, that's cool. Let me see.
Yeah, you go to Fayetteville and some of these places, and you think about, okay, there was one church over here in Fayetteville.
There's one
another.
picture. Why don't we let's see if we can zoom in on this. So this is ready for the St. Thomas School, Wilmington. It's kind of, let's see if we can do it real quick. See if we can get that African American sister with African American kids.
Yep.
That's kind of interesting.
And here's one that actually has some connection to me and you. So your dad was ordained. That was the first.
Yeah, St. Anne's.
Yeah, St. Anne's in Fayetteville was actually the first church that was built to be integrated from start, right? And actually, it was 6 African Americans who decided that they wanted a Catholic church too, and so they started meeting in a barbershop. Mm-hmm. Right, and so now when you go in St. Anne's, in the little chapel part that's in the back, which actually used to be the church, and you go in there and you actually see all the history in those stained glass windows too.
Yeah, they're pretty neat.
Yeah, and it talks about
there's the story of what's his name in Newton Grove, the one family that converted.
Yeah,
part of it was he wanted a church where African Americans
Yep.
and white people could worship together.
Yep.
What was his name? Monk, Dr.
Monk. Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Monk.
A lot of great stories. Downtown Raleigh, St. Monica's was a Catholic school that was built right across the street. Was Monsignor Haddon's house. Monsignor Haddon, father was he wasn't a Catholic minister. He was a Protestant minister, and he sent Monsignor Haddon across the street.
Yeah.
And Monsignor Haddon says, "I want to be Catholic." So his father said, "Okay, we're going to go to church, but then you have to go to mass too." So he would take
and
him.
he had a tough time in the diocese, right? He had a few parishes that didn't want him.
Yeah.
They wanted an African American.
They were like, we don't want an African American pastor. So I mean, you even think about here in the Catholic Church, we need to be like those Quakers who went inside first and started rooting things out. So I mean, you think about it, even with the George Floyd thing, you were proactive, and you were like, something's got to be done because my community is crying out for this.
Yeah.
And your city was probably crying out for it too, right?
Yeah.
But then, you think about it, there's some places where they haven't even breached it yet.
Yeah, they don't want to talk about it.
It's like, okay, you might have all these workers, you might have African American workers or African American parishioners or people in your pastoral council, but did you even, and I'm not saying you, but I'm just saying, pastors have to think about this stuff because they are the shepherds of that flock. And it's like, did you not even step out and talk to one of your African American community members and, find out what's going on in their mind, what's their story?
Yeah.
It was a beautiful thing on the internet, and it was a master sergeant, and in the Air Force, the top enlisted guy, right? And he goes to the general, and he puts a box of Band-Aids on the table, on the desk, and he walks out, or he just stands there, and the general's like looking at him going, you know what, I know, Master Sergeant, you're trying to tell me something here, I'm just not getting it, what is it? He goes, what do you think about this? Because it makes me mad. And what it was is a Band-Aid package, and the Band-Aid said it was flesh tone, but it was pink. So it was like, okay, so who? He's like, because if I put it on me, it's not. And the same thing too, when I worked at a pharmaceutical company, and Zantac was like one of our big products, right? And we started making a gel dose because the elderly couldn't swallow the chalky tablets, right? But the gel is made out of, pork.
Yeah.
Or, and so the Jewish community wouldn't. So we realized that a lot of our Jewish doctors and Muslim doctors weren't prescribing, Zantac. So we went to them and said, what's going on? You have this big GI practice, but why are you not prescribing our stuff? Because we know you guys have a lot of elderly too. And they said, you know what? Thank you for asking, because it's made with gelatin, and gelatin is not kosher, or it doesn't meet halal standards, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Cultural
Yeah.
sensitivity.
So it's the same thing. It's like, okay, if you have something that's going on and falling out in your neighborhood, and you think about it, with the scandal that we have within the church, now we have all kinds of things that have been put in place for that. So what have we done? In people now, where Catholic churches are starting to close, and you got the Polish church that has to now be combined with the Irish church, people are starting to go, whoa, wait a minute, you closed our church down, but now we're over here, and it's like we're in a, so it's like, okay, well, if you have an African American community, the expectation is too that you address, or at least be attentive to African American needs.
Well, I think it's the challenge is, like I was mentioning before, is you need to have a certain cultural awareness in America because of the great diversity. I mean, there's the African American and white thing, but there's Hispanics, there's Asian, there's folks from the Caribbean. Because it was interesting, I was in a class with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal, who now teaches at Duke. Generally speaking, I disagree with his politics now, but he was a brilliant teacher. He was one of my favorite teachers. And it was a really fun conversation because the class was called Interrogating Blackness. And we dealt with some of the history. And we had everything. I would say, honestly, like I was one of the few white people of European descent. So we had we had Jews, they're not quite European descent. We had a Jew in the class, we had a Native American, we had Africans from the Caribbean, we had Africans from Africa, we had some Hispanics. It was a very lively conversation. And I wish we could have recorded some of those. And there was one conversation, and hopefully this isn't too taboo, but it was like the Native American kid got on the Jewish kid. He was like, what's the difference between what happened to Native Americans and what happened to Jews? Like, why do we do so much time on the Holocaust, but we don't focus at all what happened at Wounded Knee? And somebody was like, well, money and stuff like that. And I was like, whoa. But it was intense, but actually.
We need to be able to have those conversations, right? And sometimes just lay it out on the table so that, whatever what is it? We used to have those team building people whenever there was some strife within an organization. You come in and you go, all right, you pay this consultant to come in, and they go, let's address the elephant in the room, right? And people would eventually come out and they would say what was on their mind and they would address it. But I think
I think that's one thing right now this generation is not understanding. That was a Marxist professor. He's pretty radical, but just back then the idea was that you would hear all sides and you would have an open discussion.
Right.
And you were willing to entertain multiple ideas, and that's at the heart of real dialogue. That's at the heart of. Yeah. It's because that's one of the things right now with a lot of the cancel culture and things like that. And we should probably end here in a little bit. Yeah. But is that people aren't willing to have discussions.
Yeah, and I think I think there's another hand. So there is a legitimate gripe, and I think, like I said, as reconciliation, we need to look at this as a family, especially in the Catholic Church, and we start thinking about, okay, we got some strife between our brothers and sisters, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and we're still going to be in this together because Jesus expects us. He said, "I'm building one church. I'm not building a black church." And but at the same time, too, we need to understand because we have two boys and a girl, right? And sometimes the boys are doing stuff and it's like, we can't do that because, it doesn't fit Janelle. I mean, then Janelle's not part of it. Or we can't do it for the bigger kids because Ian's too small, and so we need to do the same thing here too. And I think we need to be attentive. And really, we don't have an excuse. We have founding fathers of this church who are African, right? We've had 3 African popes. I tell that to white people sometimes, and they're just like, what?
Yeah.
And they don't know it. It's like, why we celebrate Easter when we do is because of Pope Victor, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, he was African, and people are like, oh my gosh, really? So let's have
Well, even now there's like Cardinal Sarah, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And we just got Cardinal Gregory, right, in the United States. So
exactly.
this is something major. This is
Well, that's one of the things I always loved preaching on. Whenever racial issues arose, I've given a similar homily, which is right now around the world, the Mass is being celebrated in all these different languages,
Right.
all these different cultures. Like we are united with Catholics in China, Catholics in Vietnam,
right.
Catholics in Africa, Latin America. It's a really fun, interesting dynamic. You go to Africa, and like they are members of my church, our church.
Yeah.
And it's a. And I think we'll continue to work on this. I think this is a good conversation. Do you want to have any closing thoughts right now?
Well, anybody who's listening, especially if they're calling in from any or dialing in from any of the parishes or whatever, if these are some issues that you guys think that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out to my ministry, which is under the Faith Formation Department in the Diocese. I'll be more than happy to really sit down and go through these different things and give us some strategies so we can get beyond this. Because I don't want, and it always seems like, remember Jesus always said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And it always seems the political stuff that's out there in the streets seem to get inside the doors of the church, and it really wreaks havoc. But we have to do a better job of taking those people who are hurt and helping them heal, and then also opening the eyes to our younger people to be alert, because this specter is going to be out there every generation. So we can't give up on any generation. I think that's what happened after the Reconstruction. They said, oh, finally, look, we got black people in the Senate and they're really starting to do good. Now we can start striking deals and, playing politics again, and the whole world went upside down. And then we find ourselves here, right? But there's a lot of things that we need to clean up from this mess. And unfortunately, I hate that a tragedy like George Floyd and some of the other things that are being touted as the things that we really need to be focused on. There's a bigger monster out there that we need to take on, because don't get me wrong, George Floyd's, that was a tragedy, and there's no way to. I was just as angry as anybody else, because I don't care how bad somebody is. Everybody's supposed to be given their due. As a political scientist, I'm sitting there going, this guy's civil rights, was violated. But and then you get the talking heads on each side, and it's like, no, but then it is taken up by an organization, and now it's more than what it should be. But we have to circle back around and get with our people and get them around the table and let's address this the way it should be addressed,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks so much for coming.
Always
Appreciate it.
great, Father.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
It's great.
Yeah, this was good stuff. Yeah.